Thanks, everybody. I'd like to introduce you to our next speaker, Paul Baxa, who's going to talk about the P2 Alfa fascist icon. The past becomes the present, apparently. Thanks, Paul.
Thank you, Kip. Thank you. Thank you all. I want to thank Don Capps and Bob Barr and Duke Arkensinger and everyone who make this great event happen. It was my privilege to be at the first one back in 2015, and it's amazing how this has grown over the years. So thank you for having me. Just before I get to my presentation, Jim had a slide showing the program for the 1980 US Grand Prix here. I had the privilege of being at that race back in October of 1980. I came down with my dad. And I remember Bruno Giacomelli and the Alfa Romeo getting pole position. And I came from a family of tifosi, but my dad told me that weekend, he said, a real Italian racing fan knows that Alfa Romeo is really the team to cheer for. So, and that leads me actually to today's presentation. Actually, my dad grew up in Fascist Italy, so he may have been influenced by some of the things I might be talking about today. So, on Sunday, August 3rd, 1924, the Fascist Party of Italy was holding an emergency meeting in the Palazzo Venezia in Rome. It was the height of the Matteotti crisis, and Mussolini's government was facing an uncertain future. The body of the socialist deputy, Giacomo Matteotti, was still missing after he was kidnapped by a group of fascist thugs in June. Although his fate was unknown, the expectation was that Matteotti had been assassinated and that Mussolini was to blame. At 5 p.m., during a series of tense exchanges and speeches calling for Mussolini to crack down on his enemies, the radical fascist Francesco Giunta interrupted the conference to announce that Giuseppe Campari, driving a P2 Alfa Romeo, had just won the European Grand Prix at Lyon. The next day, the front page of Italy's most important national newspaper carried two items: the PNF meeting and the Grand Prix. The account of the meeting is on the left, the Grand Prix on your right. In its report of the party meeting, the article noted Giunta's announcement. It was a bright light in an otherwise darkening situation for Mussolini and his government. 10 days after Campari's stirring victory, Matteotti's body was discovered in a shallow grave north of Rome. As it turned out, Mussolini's regime not only survived the crisis, but it became the jumping-off point for his dismantling of Italian democracy and the establishment of the fascist dictatorship. In the meantime, the P2 Alfas would go on to dominate Grand Prix racing during the 2-liter formula and beyond. To be sure, the victories of the Alfas, led by the charismatic Antonio Ascari, served as a distraction from the tumultuous events in Italy. They were also used by Mussolini to exalt the new Italy that he and his fascists were in the process of building. In the pages of Italy's most read illustrated magazine, the lead editorial in the next edition noted how the common man was more interested and excited by the exploits of the Alfas than they were by the sordid events of Roman politics. Victory at Lyon was far more important, it seemed, than the disappearance of a socialist politician. The car at the center of this was the P2, Alfa Romeo's first Grand Prix winning machine. Designed by Vittorio Jano in record time, the car was introduced at the Cremona Grand Prix in June of 24. The result was an easy victory in the hands of Antonio Ascari. With it came a new speed record on the circuit's 10-kilometer straight, clocked at 121 miles per hour. The car and the company that built it quickly became a symbol of Italy's rebirth under the sign of fascism. This paper will demonstrate the correlation between the P2, its design, and its successes with the rise of Italian fascism in the decisive years between 1924 and 1930. In those years, Mussolini consolidated his dictatorship and promoted sport as one of the regime's greatest achievements. At the party congress in August, Mussolini gave a speech where he declared that it was time for Italians to live dangerously. Present at that meeting was Roberto Farinacci, the violent fascist chief of Cremona and leader of the intransigent wing of the party. Farinacci was also a sometime race car driver and promoter of the Cremona Grand Prix. Apart from Mussolini, no one embodied fascist violence and the cult of speed more than Farinacci, a man who approved of Matteotti's assassination and called for even more bloodshed. The fact that the P2 began its legendary run of successes on his patch of Lombardy seemed fitting, especially as the Cremona road course was known for being one of the fastest racetracks in the world. In his book, Objects of Desire, a study of Italian industrial culture in the late 19th and early 20th century, Luca Cotini has argued that objects are culture makers, mediating devices, and vehicles of meaning. In the 1920s, Cotini argues Italian industrial design reached a peak of expressive energy that was found mostly in the aviation and automobile industries, two modern activities exalted by fascism. In addition, thanks to design theorists like Gio Ponti, Italian industrial products became works of art as well as commercial objects. I would add that they also became political objects, vehicles to draw Italians to Mussolini's dictatorship in the late 1920s, precisely the period that Cotini points out as the culmination of Italy's developing industrial culture and entrance into modernity. No object expressed this network of relations, I argue, more than the P2. The link between the successes of the Alfa Romeo P2 and national industrial political revival was even noted by foreign journalists. After a crushing demonstration of dominance in the 1925 European Grand Prix at Spa, the Dean of French Motorsport Writers, Charles Faroux, exclaimed how the Alfa Romeo squad embodied the Italian national renaissance. Those are the words that he used. Before it came to represent Italy's political shift, the P2 caused a qualitative shift for its company and a major shift in Italian motorsport. Based in Milan, Italy's emerging industrial and financial capital, Alfa's victory in the 24 French Grand Prix effectively knocked Fiat out of Grand Prix racing for good. Although, to be fair, I think Fiat had already essentially made the decision to leave before that. Fiat had represented racing success for Italy since the early 1900s and was the country's leading automobile manufacturer, aspiring to become Italy's Ford. Agnelli's company was based in Turin, Milan's rival for industrial prowess. Alfa's victories, therefore, not only represented success on the track, but also symbolized Milan's challenge to the Piedmontese capital. In doing this, Alfa was accomplishing in industry what Mussolini's movement was doing in politics. Like Alfa, fascism was born in Milan, a city that presented itself as a more dynamic and youthful one compared to the staid city of Turin, a city described by some fascists as filled with sticks in the mud. Quote. After winning the 1924 Italian Grand Prix, the fascist magazine La Rivista del Popolo contrasted the young, audacious Alfa with the old Fiat, end quote. Like the cities, the two companies were often presented in contrasting ways by the fascists. Turin and Fiat were throwbacks to the old liberal Italy, while Alfa and Milan were part of the new avant-garde Italy. Fascism's relationship with Turin and Fiat was a difficult one. Giovanni Agnelli, Fiat's founder, was not a fascist, and the company's labor force was mostly anti-fascist. Alfa, on the other hand, was a smaller, younger company, and its labor force would become home to former black shirts. Fiat was the past, Alfa was the future. Nothing embodied this more than the P2 project. Everything about the P2, the men who built and raced it, and the successes on the track corresponded to Mussolini's new image for Italy. Up until 1924, Alfa Romeo had limited success on international racetracks. Its success seemed to coincide with the rise of the regime. Alfa's first major victory came at the Targa Florio in 1923, international victory, only a few months after Mussolini became Prime Minister of Italy, which of course is pure coincidence, but it was something that was commented upon. That same year, the design and engineering department of the Milanese outfit was completed with the arrival of Vittorio Jano from Fiat. It was Jano and his team of engineers who put together the P2 project in record time. Both the speed of the project and the youthfulness of the team fit in with fascism's cultivation of speed and youth. Both Jano and Luigi Bazzi, who had also come over from Fiat, were in their 30s. Meanwhile, the man most responsible for bringing these men into the Alfa fold, Enzo Ferrari, was only 25 years old. According to Peter Hull and Luigi Fusi, Ferrari was the driving force behind Alfa's assembling of a crack designing team. Ferrari represented everything that Mussolini's regime extolled in Italy. He hailed from the same region as Mussolini and came from a similar modest background. After serving in the First World War, Ferrari had applied for a job at Fiat but was turned down. In later years, he would describe this moment as a turning point in his life, as fate would drive him to Milan, where he eventually joined the fledgling Alfa company. Ferrari's story thus resembled the profile of the ideal fascist in some ways, as one who was rejected by the establishment and then turned that frustration into revenge. In Ferrari's case, the revenge came with knocking Fiat out of racing. The development of the P2 was born out of a similar set of frustrations. Jano was part of the design team that had put together the Fiat 805, a car that was the class of the field in 1923, but had failed to win the French Grand Prix, which was the most important international race at the time. Aware of the car's weaknesses, Jano was not able to rectify them due to his subordinate position within the team. At Alfa, he would use the P2 project to improve on the Fiat. In his time at Fiat, Jano was shackled by the corporate structure of the company and the fact that Fiat emphasized its production cars over racing. Alfa, on the other hand, was smaller, with an increasing emphasis on high-performance sports cars. At Alfa, Jano was able to instill a military-like discipline that suited the type of rhetoric that was being pumped out by Mussolini's Italy. He joined the team in September of 23, and the first drawings for the car were completed by mid-October. The following March saw the first engine put on the test bed, and in June, the first example was taken to Monza and tested by Antonio Scotti and Giuseppe Campari just a few days before it won at Cremona. The speed of the car's production was helped by the fact that Jano was merely perfecting the Fiat 805 he had worked at in Turin. These are the Fiat 805s. This is the team that was entered in the 1923 French Grand Prix. Modifications on engine and suspension design helped produce a car that was more powerful and ultimately faster than the 805 without the reliability issues. Aesthetically, the P2 was almost a carbon copy of the Fiat, but the modifications to the engine were significant to the point where Jano later claimed that the car was a completely new design. That was his claim. In this case, unintentionally, the P2 did resemble Mussolini's movement. Fascism, too, was largely derivative, appropriating pre-existing ideas and concepts while claiming to create a new Italy. P2's successes on the track, however, appeared to usher in a revolution. While the Cremona Grand Prix demonstrated the new car's potential, it was the Grand Prix at Lyon that consecrated the P2 in the eyes of Mussolini's new Italy. The stage could not have been more appropriate. Beginning in 1923, the governing body of motorsport anointed one national Grand Prix to have the title of European Grand Prix. In 1924, it was the turn of the Grand Prix de France, or the Grand Prix de la CF, strictly speaking, also known as the French Grand Prix. Furthermore, the 1924 edition of the race was a special one since it marked the 10th anniversary of the epic 1914 race that saw the French and German teams battle on the track only weeks before the outbreak of the First World War. As a commemoration of that event, the race returned to the Lyon-Givors circuit, the scene of that historic race in 1914. The event thus served to remember a great race, but also served as a memorial to the war, a fact that fed the fascist regime's own exaltation of the war experience. The resulting race was nearly as epic as its 1914 predecessor. On the spectacular road course, it wasn't exactly the same, by the way. They cut it in half, so they used half of the original course. But they used the most exciting part. On the spectacular road course, Alfa Romeo, Fiat, Sunbeam, Delage, and Bugatti battled for over 7 hours in a race that went back and forth with numerous lead changes, with Campati's Alfa emerging triumphant. Giuseppe Campati's victory at Lyon made Alfa Romeo a national name and was able, albeit briefly, to serve as a distraction from the Matteotti crisis, as I already mentioned. The car appeared in ads for the company and for Pirelli, the tire manufacturer. This poster calls the race the Olympiad of Engines. The P2's triumph at Lyon encouraged a more bullish attitude on the part of Italy's representatives at the Sporting Commission of the AIACR, which is the forerunner of the FIA. Taking advantage of a procedural loophole, the Italian representatives tried to convince the Commission to award the title of European Grand Prix in 1925 to Italy and not to Belgium, as had been approved by the AIACR in its previous general meeting. Claiming that Italy had the stronger racing tradition proven by Alfa's victory at Lyon, Arturo Mercanti, one of the two representatives, argued that Italy deserved the race, not Belgium. The challenge, which caused some friction at the Sporting Commission's meeting in the fall of '24, was unsuccessful. However, the Italian delegation did succeed in persuading the Sporting Commission to create a world championship for manufacturers in 1925. The desire to use Alfa's triumphs to elevate Italy's international motorsport prestige mirrored the fascist regime's attempts to make Italy into a world power. In 1925, Mussolini turned to the dismantling of the Italian liberal state in the wake of the Matteotti assassination, an event that should have been his end, but instead marked the beginning of fascist Italy's rise to power. The new secretary of the fascist party was none other than Roberto Farinacci, the patron of the Cremona Grand Prix, an intransigent fascist who now aimed to activate Mussolini's call for living dangerously. The events on the racetracks of Europe reflected the radical and violent shift in Italian politics. 1925 was to be the last year of the successful 2-liter formula, and Alfa set its sights on dominating the opposition in 3 races: the European Grand Prix at Spa, the French Grand Prix at the new Montlhéry Autodrome, and the Italian Grand Prix at Monza. Alfa's approach to these races involved a degree of swagger and even arrogance. They lapped the field at Spa, prompting jeers from the partisan crowd. After crossing the line, Ascati's car had a giant Italian flag placed on the hood. There is a story about this race that I didn't find any of the contemporary accounts, but it kind of was told later by motorsport historians, that in order to taunt the crowd, the Alfas, because they had lapped everybody, and I think all the French cars had dropped out actually, so there was just 2 Alfas kind of circulating in the last part of the race. At one point, they made such a lengthy pit stop that they took out a table and laid out a food spread. It's a great story. It might be apocryphal, though. because I didn't find it in contemporary accounts. And Giovanni Canestrini, who's kind of one of the dean of motorsport historians, later said it wasn't really like that. It was just simply, they had some panini, sandwiches ready. And the pit stops took a bit longer than usual. So they had, Ascari and Campari had time to down a sandwich. And that's really all it was. But so it's one of those wonderful stories, but it might be apocryphal. Whatever, though, it still shows a certain degree of swagger, whatever it was, on the part of the Alfa team. The Alfas were also dominating the French Grand Prix until Antonio Ascari crashed and was killed while leading the race, prompting the team to withdraw from the race. As a final gesture of defiance, the two remaining Alfas revved their engines loudly before leaving the race, and that is in a contemporary account. So they stopped in the pits and they started revving their engines. Now that was probably a salute to Ascari, but again, you can interpret that as kind of a defiant gesture. It was Brilli Peri, Gastone Brilli Peri, who gave Alfa the world championship when he won the Italian Grand Prix in September. No one represented the new order in Grand Prix racing better than Antonio Ascari. His name became synonymous with the P2 and with the Living Dangerously motto promoted by Mussolini and Farinacci. He had given the P2 its first victory at Cremona and won at Monza in 1924 and at Spa in 1925. More than his victories, he came to embody a certain aggressiveness in his driving. He would be the first example of what would later be called the Garibaldino approach to racing. That's a reference to Giuseppe Garibaldi, the guy who helped unify Italy. This Garibaldino tag is most famously embodied by the likes of Tazio Nuvolari in the 1930s, but Ascari really was the first to kind of get that reputation. In short, he took risks. At Monza in 1924, his driving prompted a rebuke from the race director, who instructed Alfa Romeo to slow him down, or they would call him in. This is the telegram that was sent from the race director, who was Arturo Mercanti, to the Alfa Romeo pit, saying, tell Ascari to slow down, otherwise we're going to call him in. It's because he was going too, on the banking, he was going too close to the guardrail at the top. His style of driving ultimately proved his undoing. While dominating the French Grand Prix in 1925, he continuously brushed the apex of a fast left-hand turn coming within inches of a wooden fence. On lap 22, he came too close, clipping the fence and rolling the car, which led to his death. And in this illustration, you can see the fence, the back right, and the marshals acting pretty quickly, actually, and rather dangerously. Ascari's death at Montlhéry resulted in an outpouring of grief and a state funeral in Milan. He became Fascist Italy's first racing martyr, and that word was, in fact, used. When his body returned to Italy on a train, a large wreath from Mussolini was placed on the casket. This photograph is actually at the train station in Paris, and the Italian ambassador is in there somewhere. And his body has just been loaded on the train. Across the wreath that was donated by Mussolini were the words "L'intrepido," the intrepid one. The funeral card repeated Mussolini's epithet with a message that read, and the funeral card is on the right. It read, "Antonio Ascari, the intrepid one, who sacrificed himself defending with undefeated faith the colors of the fatherland and Italian industry." Although he had been racing since the 1910s, Ascari's memory is indelibly marked with the P2. Not only did the car symbolize triumph, but it now also created martyrs. Speed and death in the service of glory found echoes in fascist rhetoric. The response to Ascari's death and his depiction as a martyr to speed became the response template for the numerous Italian drivers killed in Grand Prix racing over the next decade. But none of them would be as celebrated as a Scotti, which owed a great deal to the Alfa Romeo P2. And in fact, I don't have a hard number in my head, but Italy probably produced more dead race drivers in the late 20s and 30s than any other country, but I can't say that for certainty. But there were a number of Italian drivers who were killed in that period. Unwilling to build a new car for the new 1.5-liter formula introduced in 1926 and troubled by financial problems, Alfa withdrew from Grand Prix racing after the 25 season. The legend of the P2 continued on, though, as the car would enjoy an afterlife that kept it winning races until 1930, mostly run by the Scuderia Ferrari. In 1928, the AIACR introduced the Formula Libera rules, which allowed this car to enter the official Grand Prix races. It was in this era that the legend of the car actually deepened. In the late 20s, Grand Prix racing entered a period of doldrums. Indicative of this was the fact that there was only one Grand Prix race held in 1928 at Monza. It would not be an exaggeration to say that Italy saved the sport, or Grand Prix racing in particular, in these years, with the P2 right at its center. At Monza, all the attention of the Italian press, especially the newspapers closely associated with the Fascist Party, focused on the P2 driven by driven by Achille Varzi. Here's a picture from that race. This might be possibly the first photograph of Achille Varzi and Tazio Nuvolati racing, wheel to wheel. That's Varzi in the P2 on the right, and Nuvolati in a Bugatti on the left. Nuvolati had his own team at this point, and he ran Bugattis. And here they're coming down the Rettifiglio of the Monza Autodrome. I think Nuvolati dropped out of this race, and Varzi finished second to another Bugatti driven by Louis Chiron. In 1929, the cars were run by the new Scuderia Ferrari, where former Alfa personnel like Ferrari and Luigi Bazzi were reunited with the P2s. In 1930, the P2s were driven by Achille Varzi and Tazio Nuvolati, thus launching what was to become the most legendary driver rivalry in Italian motorsports in the 1930s, probably of all time. One last epic victory came at the Targa Florio in 1930 in the hands of Achille Varzi. By 1930, the P2 had been substantially modified. This included the adoption of the flat slanted radiator taken from the Alfa 1500 and 1750 sports car models. These cars, which brought Alfa more glory in the Mille Miglia races, were directly inspired by the P2. According to the Alfa Romeo historian Peter Hull, this made Alfa the only marque which directly transferred Grand Prix technology to sports cars and vice versa. That's Peter Hull's claim. The introduction of the high-performance six-cylinder sports cars, also designed by Vittorio Jano, made Alfa the most prestigious Italian maker of sports cars into the 1930s in Italy, thus establishing itself, and worldwide possibly, thus establishing itself as the marque most suitable to the fascist era and Mussolini's regime building, a process that was completed by 1929. As the modified P2s raced into their swan song year of 1930, fascism had completed the dismantling of the liberal state, and sport had become completely fascicized. Fiat, in the meantime, after an aborted attempt to return to Grand Prix racing in 1927, turned its attention to mass-produced utility vehicles, a turn to the masses that would shape fascist policy in the 30s. As fascist Italy entered the decade of the 30s, Alfa Romeo had become closely identified with Mussolini. He called Alfa Romeo our best national product, and was increasingly seen at the wheel of an Alfa. Here he is driving, I believe that's a 1750, around the new Littorio Autodrome in Rome, which is a purpose-built track in Rome, which no longer exists. It's now an airport. In 1951, with Italy embroiled in a war that was going from bad to worse, Alfa Romeo's magazine published a retrospective on the P2. Written by Corrado Filippini, one of Italy's leading motorsport journalists, this article summed up the importance of the P2 for Italy's national prestige. The 2 years of Alfa domination in 24 and 25 were characterized by Filippini as the most spectacular era of Italian genius. Ignoring the fact that the P2 was largely based on the Fiat 805, the retrospective claimed that the P2 had set a new standard for race car design, calling it, quote, authentically avant-garde. For Filippini, proof of the car's greatness came in the 1930 period, when this older car was beating newer cars, sometimes. Moreover, Filippini was confident that the car could even hold its own against contemporary competition. That would be auto unions and Mercedes, so make of that what you will. Hyperbole aside, Filippini's article demonstrated the continued legacy of a car that had elevated Italy to the top of Grand Prix racing in an era when Mussolini's fascist regime was being constructed. In peacetime, Alfa Romeo contributed to the triumphs of Italy on the track. In 1941, Alfa's production was directed to the war effort, and although the Italians were struggling on the battlefield, its Axis partner was walking all over Europe. For Filippini's readers, memories of the P2 could be harnessed in the hope that Italian technology could once again triumph, while history would demonstrate otherwise. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. That was fascinating. Anyone have questions?
Hey, Kip, we have a question from the internet for Paul. Terry Johnson writes, are there any P2 Alphas currently appearing at vintage and/or historic events?
I don't know if they appear at events, but I think there are still 2 in existence. There's an original P2, the first spec of the P2 in the Alfa Romeo Museum in Arese. And there is one of the later P2s at the Automobile Museum in Torino or Turin. So I know that they exist. I don't know if they take them out on the track, though.
Anyone have a question?
I'm just interested in your commentary on the state sponsorship of Alfa Romeo or other Italian motor manufacturing and how this episode plays into that, if it does or if it does not. Thank you.
Yeah, that's an important question. The fascist regime did not subsidize the racing teams the way the Nazi regime did. But Mussolini did intervene on a few occasions to save the company from bankruptcy. In 1933, though, Alfa Romeo was taken over by or was bailed out by the IRI, which was the state-run bailout institution. So after 33, it did become a state-owned team, and but it wasn't racing officially as a works team. Alphas were always raced by the Scuderia Ferrari. However, in 1938, they did come back as an official team, Alfa Corse. So in that sense, yes, it was, because it was effectively owned by the state at this point. So, yeah, so I don't know if that answers your question.
Paul, it turns out I have something of a follow-up question, which is to compare, if not narrowly regarding finances, the Nazi use of symbolism in racing during this time with the Italians.
In what sense?
Were they equally active, more successful in using auto racing as a means of political expression and so on?
Oh, yes, yeah. Yes, absolutely. The Nazi regime, of course, would very much celebrate its victories, the German car's victories, and Italy did the same for the motorsport magazines, but even in the national newspapers, there would always be front page coverage when Alfa won a race. So you did have a similar type use of propaganda for the races, absolutely. So I don't know if that really answers your question. Okay.
Paul, we may have one more coming in from the internet. Stand by.
All right. Was there a hand up here, though? Yeah, right there.
Thank you very much. When Fascist Italy no longer existed, did Alfa Romeo struggle to shift any kind of negative associations with it, or was it relatively smooth sailing?
That's a really good question. They were able, I think, to shift rather easily into the post-war, and that goes with any sporting hero, actually, under fascism. Even the great cyclists like Bartoli and the soccer teams, they were all able to really easily transition. Simon Martin, a sports historian who's written on Italian sports history, makes this argument. And it shows that the sporting heroes were able to create their own kind of popularity or their own niche in the Italian imagination that transcended fascism. So I don't know, perhaps going back to Jim's earlier question, that shows that maybe the regime was not as successful ultimately in making it truly fascist. I have to say, though, that the managing director of Alfa Romeo, his name was Ugo Gobato, and he was appointed by Mussolini after the state took over the company in 1933. He was assassinated by the Italian resistance in 1945. And so, not to be cynical, but I think by getting rid of him, even though he was not, as far as I know, he was not a convinced fascist. In fact, he had an industrial background. He had worked for Fiat. He had actually designed the Lingotto factory in Turin, if you're familiar with that. But he kind of paid the price, if you will, for Alfa Romeo's association with the regime. So maybe that was enough to make others forget and keep cheering for Alfa Romeo afterwards. Alfa Romeo remained a state-run company until the 1980s. And then it was taken over by Fiat, if I'm not mistaken.
Any other questions? Or Eric, do you have your
I do. So Paul, Groovy Joanne writes, were there any drivers that felt unhappy about Italy's fascism back then?
Great question. There is no one that comes to mind. I don't know of any driver that comes to mind that was either anti-fascist or in some way bothered by the regime. Now, not to say that these guys were fascists necessarily. Antonio Ascari, I think, belonged to a local fascist cell in Milan. Gastone Brilli Peri, whom I mentioned, he's the one that won the 25 Italian Grand Prix. I think he was known to be a fascist, actually politically active fascist. As for the others, I would argue they were neither fascists or anti-fascists. As far as I know, again, we don't know enough. This is a gap in the research, I think. We don't know enough about a lot of these drivers during the fascist era because they didn't write much. Nuvolati did write a couple of articles, or had it written for him, I don't know. But his name was attached to them in some of the sporting magazines, where he used some fascist language. Enzo Ferrari, actually, in the Enzo Ferrari newsletters, would write periodically articles that exalted Mussolini's regime. But you have to remember, too, that after the war, there was a lot of post-hoc refashioning or sanitizing of a lot of this, and a lot of drivers, a lot of people who carried over did not really talk much about that past politically anyway. So we don't know enough on that topic, but it's a great question.
Thank you, Paul. That was terrific.
Thank you.